In September 1954, Bill Farrer and his wife Barbara moved into a new home in the historic market town of Pontefract, England. They were a young family with a 2-year-old daughter named Jane, and so 30 East Drive with its 3 bedrooms and, for the time, luxurious indoor toilet should have made the ideal home. And yet, less than a year later, they moved out, convincing a second family, the Pritchards, to swap houses with them. After all, the Farrers were terrified of their home. Objects would move of their own volition, voices were heard echoing in empty rooms, and rips and tears would spontaneously appear on soft furnishings. In particular, Bill and Barbara feared for their daughter. She would, so they claimed, be found crying, her face inexplicably covered in blood and scratches. The family had no pets on who to blame their injuries, and even after they placed cotton mitts over the little girl's hands, the bloody wounds continued to appear. Jane cried every night, leaving her parents utterly confused as to what to do. That was until one day when Barbara rushed upstairs in response to her child's crying, and found a pillow had been placed over her face. After that, the answer was clear. They had to flee. And so they did, leaving the house and its dark occupier to the Pritchard family, thus marking the lesser-known origins of what would soon become the infamous case of the East Drive Poltergeist, the diabolical Black Monk of Pontefract. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Before we discuss this case any further, if you could please allow a brief moment for me to thank the sponsor of this video, Raycon. Most of us love listening to music. It's one of those human experiences that is universal. That said though, it's not always appropriate to have music playing, either in a communal space at home, outdoors, in public, or at work, so I'm always looking for a way to put on my favourite sounds and escape the moment, all while being discreet and functional. In this way, Raycon's wireless, noise-isolating everyday earbuds are one of my essential daily accessories. Super snug, super seamless earbuds that I can take with me everywhere in order to get easy access to crisp and clear sound. I especially love using them about the house, as with wireless connectivity up to 33 feet away from my phone, they offer convenience as well as premium sound. I can move about, even going outside into the garden so as to get the tasks I need to do done, all while listening to my favourite music or podcast. And by enabling awareness mode simply by using the intuitive earbud tap functions, I can still interact with others, with what's going on around me being audible alongside my music. Since the start of the year, I've been integrating meditation into my routine, and not having wires dangling from my ears as I listen to meditation music and healing frequencies has really helped me to focus. Not only that, having an almost custom, comfortable in-ear fit with Raycon's everyday earbuds coming with 5 pairs of different size silicone gel tips makes my listening experience utterly seamless. With such high quality attention to detail without the typically high price of other premium audio brands, it's no wonder Raycon's everyday earbuds have over 50,000 5-star reviews. So if you're ready to buy something small with a big impact, simply click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/paranormal scholar to get 15% off your Raycon purchase. Thank you for listening and thus helping to support my channel. Now, on with the video. Much has been said and written about the Black Monk of Pontefract. Regarded as a classic British case of poltergeist phenomena on par with the infamous Enfield poltergeist, it loosely inspired a 2012 horror movie and has been investigated via visits to the property associated with the happenings by innumerable paranormal teams. Perhaps one of the most famous, or at least significant visits to 30 East Drive took place decades earlier, in August 1980, before the publication of the book Poltergeist, when Colin Wilson, the well-known writer of more than 100 books on subjects including mysticism and the paranormal, visited the by then long-suffering Pritchard family. Wilson had been tipped off by another researcher by the name of Tom Cunniff. A local amateur historian, he had stumbled across newspaper clippings dating to the late 1960s that alleged tremendously that a Pontefract family had experienced poltergeist phenomena caused by the ghost of a 16th century monk who had been executed for assaulting and murdering several young victims. When Cunniff discovered that the family was still living in the same house, he knew he had to visit them to hear their testimonies. Not long afterwards, he contacted Colin Wilson, and so it was that Wilson made the journey to the Yorkshire town to interview the family. According to the details recorded in his book, the activity began not as you might expect, more than 10 years after the house swap with the Farrers. Despite Bill Farrer's claim that his young daughter was regularly and aggressively assaulted by some unseen force within the house, it seems as though the Pritchard family, comprising a mother, father, son and daughter, lived there in relative peace until the August of 1966. It was a Thursday, and most of the family, Joe Pritchard, his wife Jean, and their then 12-year-old daughter Diane, were away on holiday in Devon. They had left their 15-year-old son Philip, along with Jean's mother Sarah Scholes, at the house. The arrangement, to begin with at least, seemed to suit the family. Philip had reached the age when holidays with the family lose their attraction, and so spent much of his time happily reading in the garden. On that Thursday he was outside as such. When he returned indoors to make himself a drink, he noticed something peculiar. His grandmother, sitting in the living room engrossed in her knitting, oblivious to the cloud of grey-white dust that was floating in the air around her. It was said to have been chalk-like and powdery, and more than that, appeared to be falling, not from the ceiling, but from a level below Philip's head. The top half of the room was perfectly clear. The curious dust seemed to be materializing from nothing. When Sarah went to get help to clean it up from her other daughter, Marie Kelly, they found more strangeness in the kitchen. Several large pools of water on the floor. They seemed to have no origin or explanation. Meanwhile, the dust in the living room continued to fall like a miniature snowstorm, with a fine white layer of the unidentified material having formed on the furniture, and even as a film on top of the cup of tea Philip had made for his grandmother. As the younger woman tried to mop up in the kitchen, new puddles would supposedly manifest. Pulling up the linoleum revealed no leak underneath, neither was water falling from above. And so, just like the dust in the other room, the puddles seemed to have come from nowhere. The odd domestic drama is then described as heightening when, after the water supply to the house was turned off by a helpful neighbour, the water company was called to the property. Pipes were checked, the linoleum once again lifted, and drains examined, poked and rodded. Nothing was broken or blocked, and so some strange sort of condensation caused by the summer weather was the water company's man's best explanation. About an hour after he left, the mysterious puddles stopped appearing. Before the day was over, however, more odd happenings were reported. Sugar and tea leaves were emptied from their dispensers in the kitchen, sprinkled all over the countertops. Cupboards were vibrated and shook, loud bangs were heard coming from upstairs, and a plant, usually located at the foot of the staircase, was transported halfway up, minus its pot. That, somehow, had been moved separately, being found on the landing above. Unable to tolerate the house any longer, Philip and his grandmother left and slept with Aunt Marie for the night. Vic Kelly, Marie's husband, supposedly unhappy at the strange situation, is described as phoning the police to have them check on the house. Everything seemed normal. There was no intruder or anything otherwise out of the ordinary. And yet, around midnight, just as Vic Kelly left the house for the final time that day, 2 small paintings are said to have fallen from the wall, with the glass being shattered on one of Jean and Joe Pritchard's wedding photos. It had also, so it is alleged, been slashed from end to end, as if with a sharp knife. Chilled, Vic Kelly simply closed the front door of 30 East Drive and walked back to his own home. Thus began the paranormal activity for the Pritchard family. When Jean, Joe and their daughter Diane returned from their holiday, Sarah relayed the unsettling happenings. There was disbelief, but also, as Sarah told her daughter and son-in-law, supposedly 3 loud distinct bangs and a cold wind which blew through the house. After that, there was nothing more, with the activity disappearing, at least for the next 2 years. For, according to the testimonies recorded by Colin Wilson, the activity at 30 East Drive truly began for the Pritchards in 1968. The strangeness seems to have restarted when Jean decided to redecorate her daughter's bedroom. Mysterious temperature changes were reported, as were inexplicable bangs and knocks, and then, sensationally, a paintbrush being flung across the room by unseen hands, supposedly missing Jean's face by only a fraction of an inch. It is even claimed that Mrs. Pritchard witnessed, in the dim of the night as she went to the bathroom, a long strip of wallpaper standing on end and swaying like a cobra. There was no one holding it, and when she went to grab it, it fell to the floor. Horrifically, the carpet sweeper is then said to have flew up into the air, swinging around as if being used as a club by an invisible giant. Screaming, Jean dropped onto all fours and rushed back to her bedroom, as wallpaper and other things continued to be thrown towards her. And so, the unseen presence in the house had returned, and was, so it seemed, more aggressive than ever, and was for some reason focused on Diane's bedroom. What followed next has been described as 9 months of chaos, a peculiar gestation period during which all manner of violent activity was reported. Bangs and thumps would be heard coming from Diane's bedroom to such a physically aggressive degree that she occasionally took to sleeping in her parents' room. Ornaments would be thrown as well as levitated. The lights would be turned off repeatedly along with the main switchboard. One time, the entire contents of the family's china cabinet is said to have been thrown out onto the floor, with not a single precious item smashed or chipped in the process. A particularly chilling incident, which signalled an increase in the seriousness of the activity, saw the lights go out and a huge shadow appear on the wall. Diane is said to have witnessed this first-hand and up close in the hall, while her mother scrambled with a torch to turn the lights back on. As the teenage girl watched on, a hall stand, described as a heavy piece of furniture made of oak, reportedly floated up into the air and moved towards her. Tripping as she tried to get away from it, Diane fell so that her back was against the stairs, and the hall stand on top of her. The heavy piece of furniture pressed down on her, pinning her against the stairs, as another weighty object, the electric sewing machine which had been on top of the stand, fell onto her also. When the lights came on and revealed her breathless entrapment, her family rushed to aid her. But the stand was too heavy, too solid in its placement for it to be moved. Joe and Jean heaved and struggled to free their child, and yet, strangely, fear aside, Diane was fine. She was not, as one might expect, being crushed. The heavy piece of furniture was simply being held in place by some unseen force, just enough to keep her trapped, but not enough to hurt her. Instructed to relax, the force adjusted, and the hall stand and sewing machine were able to be removed. The alleged poltergeist thus had, one can say, a fascination with Diane Pritchard. In addition to the hall stand incident, it was reported that she would be tossed from her bed as many as 4 times in a night by the unseen entity. Her bedroom was reported to become icy cold, and she would even tell her parents that it felt as though someone else was with her in the room. On one occasion, as she stood in the living room combing her hair in the mirror, a brass crucifix is said to have leapt from the shelf and struck her in the back. Not merely that, it stuck to her like a magnet against iron. Whatever had done it was, so it seemed, holding it against her. When the crucifix finally came free, her mother inspected her and found what has been described as a cross-shaped red mark on her skin between her shoulder blades. The injury supposedly remained for days. And so, before too long, 30 East Drive earned something of a local reputation. After being featured in 2 Yorkshire newspapers in September 1968, people would either actively avoid the house or seek to engage with its alleged hauntedness. Ghost hunters attempted to gain admission, with it even reported that a group of students who had asked for permission to camp in the garden were forced to content themselves with the huge round grass verge in front of the house when Jean Pritchard rejected their request. Even from such a distance, however, it is said that they heard assorted bangs and crashes, with it becoming somewhat usual for the Pritchard family's neighbours to experience the activity from inside their own homes. The noises were supposedly that loud. Not merely that, when the family's possessions, indeed the entire contents of the upstairs rooms of the house, were allegedly thrown out of the windows and onto the ground below, it was impossible for others in the area to deny something strange was going on. Eventually, the family took to calling their unwanted houseguest Mr. Nobody, and then later Fred. As much as he tried to force them to leave, the Pritchards remained. Certainly, when a local vicar called Reverend Davy came to advise the family, telling them that there was something evil in their house and that they should move, Jean is said to have scoffed and replied something along the lines of, "Why should I be driven out of my home by a ghost?" And certainly, this was a view which Jean embraced wholeheartedly. As bad as the happenings became, she continued. Spilled food, a favourite activity for Mr. Nobody, would be meticulously swept away. Jam, smeared over door handles and covered in toilet paper, was wiped away. And china plates and cups tossed onto the floor were cleaned and restacked in their cabinet. The family was not going to be chased away, not even when both Jean and Joe saw a very tall, dim figure with a hood over their head standing in the doorway of their bedroom. They had been in bed, and upon hearing the door creak open, had turned to see the terrifying apparition standing there. Before too long, others reported seeing a tall figure wearing a long hooded garment as well. At night, scared in their rooms, members of the family also reported hearing loud, laboured breathing outside of their doors. Thus, it was clear that Mr. Nobody, Fred, or as he was increasingly known, the monk, was becoming more powerful. The activity is reported to have reached its zenith one evening when the lights went out and Diane, so she, her mother and brother alleged, was dragged up the stairs by her throat. The teenage girl's cardigan, so Colin Wilson records in his book, was stretched out in front of her as if Fred was tugging at it with one hand, whilst his other clamped around her neck. Roused into action by her screams of terror, Philip and Jean rushed to pull Diane back down the stairs, but they were both repelled. Regardless, Diane then found herself free. According to Philip, it was as though his thought of trying to touch the presence had caused it to let go of his sister. Inspecting the shaking and terrified girl in the light, the family saw that her throat was covered with red finger marks. And so the family was terrified. Whilst they did not want to leave their home, they certainly wanted whatever lived there with them to leave. Contacting religious men, praying and sprinkling the interior of the property with holy water all did little to stop the happenings. If anything, it made it worse. Thus, eventually, in an act of seeming desperation, the Pritchards turned to garlic for help. Supposedly, one of Joe's friends, recently returned from Scotland, told of how the crofters there hung cloves of garlic over doors and windows to keep out spirits. Fascinatingly, when they did the same, the activity dwindled, decreased, and then finally disappeared. Thus, what had started for the Pritchards in August 1966 had ceased for 2 years, then returned in 1968, was over by May 1969. At the time of his meeting with the family in 1980, Colin Wilson had nothing to report about ongoing activity. And so, if these reports are as true as they are alleged, the happenings at 30 East Drive appear to be a cut-and-dry case of poltergeist activity, very much similar to many other reported instances of noisy spirit hauntings, from the 1977 to 79 happenings in Enfield, London, to the equally active paranormal phenomena reported in late 1920s Poona, India. The activity centred on adolescents, first a 15-year-old Philip in 1966 and then later an equivalently aged Diane in 1968, with Wilson even writing that nothing would really happen in the house when Diane was at school. Objects, even things as large and heavy as solid oak furniture, were said to have been moved by unseen hands. Food also seemed to be irresistible to the entity. Just as in the 1928 Poona case, food would mysteriously manifest bite marks, such as in the case of a chicken sandwich at 30 East Drive, and eggs were reported to have been thrown, smashed, and even exploded by Jean and her family. Even the appearance of puddles of water on the kitchen floor right at the beginning of the Pontefract case can be said to be a hallmark of other poltergeist cases, with the highly regarded parapsychological researcher Guy Lyon Playfair even having suggested that the neat little puddles found both in the Pritchards' home and others also allegedly assaulted by poltergeists may be some manner of condensation of the energy used by the entity. That the activity disappeared as the children grew up, slipping through adolescence towards adulthood, is also consistent with other poltergeist cases. And yet there are many who would argue otherwise, that not merely did the activity at 30 East Drive never stop, but that it had predated the Pritchards and their teenage children by over 10 years. Certainly, at the start of this video, I myself referenced a testimony said to have been provided by Bill Farrer, who, along with his wife Barbara and their 2-year-old daughter Jane, lived at the property before the Pritchards. Presented in the 2019 book The Black Monk of Pontefract, this testimony alleges all manner of horrific happenings. A baby girl covered in bloody scratch marks, and even the attempted suffocation of the same child by the, we can only assume, same black monk entity alleged by the Pritchards. And yet, as ominous as these claims are, it is distinctly peculiar that nothing similar was reported by Jean and Joe Pritchard of their young children. Having taken 30 East Drive off the hands of the Farrers in the mid-1950s, they, by the time of the alleged start of the activity in August 1966, had thus been in the house for many years. With Diane 12 years old in 1966, she would have had plenty of opportunities to have been targeted by the Black Monk entity in a similar way to baby Jane Farrer. But as far as we are aware, she wasn't. Why is this so? Of course, that is not to say that an otherworldly entity would act in a logical manner. Perhaps the poltergeist, or whatever it was simply in some sort of paranormal hibernation for a decade or more, making the discrepancy a curious but innocent detail. And yet it can be said to grow, to become all the more curious when one studies its source, the 2019 book The Black Monk of Pontefract. Indeed, the text's authors, paranormal researcher Richard Estep and the current owner of 30 East Drive, film producer Bill Bungie, make rather a song and dance about how Bill Farrer represents a hitherto unknown origin to the Pontefract case. In the book, this new start is eventually used as a launch pad for that ultimate conclusion that the Black Monk of Pontefract is less likely to be a poltergeist and more likely some manner of demonic entity which remains in the property to this day. And for certain, it is indisputable that the Farrer family not only existed but indeed lived at the property before the Pritchards. There are records aplenty to prove this. In fact, so many records that it can be quite easily said that the authors claim presented, allegedly, via Mr. Farrer in their book, that the family moved into 30 East Drive in September 1954 and were gone within a year due to the horrific activity, can be confidently disproved. For example, an electoral roll dating to the 20th of November 1953, almost a full year before they allegedly moved in, places them at 30 East Drive. Precisely when they moved in, and more importantly, how quickly they moved out, is unclear. Either way, it was not less than 12 months, as is claimed, and so hardly a shotgun stay in a demonic house. Interestingly, in terms of the claims made by the house's current owner, he states that a local census proves that the Farrers lived there in 1954, and thus have a right to comment on its level of demonic infestation. In reality, censuses in the UK occur once every decade, meaning in this case either in 1951 or 1961. Given that the book claims that they were there for less than 12 months after September 1954, such would be impossible. And so either Bill Bungie and his co-writer cannot tell the difference between a census and a register of electors, or they are fluffing the facts. Somewhat ironically, Bungay and Estep, when presenting their alleged evidence, even start their Farrer family chapter with the statement, "Historians know the importance of carrying out extensive research and establishing the facts." Perhaps they should have adhered to their own wisdom, most especially as there are other date discrepancies in their book. And so, why is this worthy of mentioning? Is this important in terms of assessing the Black Monk of Pontefract case? I would say that it is very important. After all, one of the strongest, if you will, selling points of the Pontefract case is that it is ongoing and represents over 60 years of continuing, very much physical paranormal activity. When reading the current owner's 2019 book, the reader is regaled with tale after tale and provided with photograph after photograph of dark demonic entities, the sorts of things that no one in their right mind would ever want to encounter in the dark of night, least of all in the uncomfortable confines of 30 East Drive's Coal House. For certainly, the coal house at the property is today famously spooky, the site of many scratches and suffocating sensations. It is, we are led to believe, the dark epicenter of the hellish happenings. And yet there is no mention of this in Colin Wilson's authoritative 1981 book which covers the case. The briefest reference is made to a lady's coat being relocated into the tiny room, kept in pristine condition, so we are told, by the thoughtful Black Monk. But other than that, the space is irrelevant. Rather, it is the sitting room, so the Pritchards' interviews reveal, that was considered the most active room. And so, why the present-day focus on the coal house? Could it be that the property's current owner is trying to amp up the theatre of the house by stuffing visitors into a dark, confined space, all while telling them that it is the most violent and overwhelming place in the property? It is certainly suspicious, and should give the measure of the man who currently owns the property, and thus is by default responsible for the case's legacy and preservation. In this way, such suspicions and blatant untruths, to the cynically minded at least, make it very difficult to trust anything which is presented in the book. Not merely that, the persistent posturing of Bungay throughout the book, expressed via his claims, "I am a visual expert, I am a filmmaker, trust me, I would tell you if any one of these images or pieces of footage are fake," adds a deeper layer of distrust, with his claims thus coming across as the equivalent of a meme-ish "trust me bro" post on an internet forum. Add to this some of the undoubtedly fake evidence which has come from the property in recent years, shared both online and via television shows such as Most Haunted, and this becomes a minefield of mistrust. Consider the testimony of John Fraser, the well-respected member of the Council of the Society for Psychical Research, who emailed Bill Bungay on multiple occasions about visiting the property in 2018, and the cynicism rockets off the charts. Not merely were Fraser's requests ignored once he revealed he was a member of the long-standing and reputable SPR, but when he did visit the house, smuggling himself in via another group, he supposedly experienced nothing paranormal whatsoever. Fraser was also keen to highlight the purposefully curated Hollywood horror atmosphere of the location, with many unsettling artifacts, including creepy dolls and porcelain clowns, having been introduced into the house. Designed, so Fraser writes, to prime some people and ultimately give even the most hardened investigator strange and intensive nightmares. And so, in short, such misdirection and mishandling of the case by its present owner can be said to damage the otherwise compelling claims made by the Pritchard family in the late 1960s and early 1980s. For certainly there is much that can be said to be compelling, much which lies in the very claim that the entity stalking 30 East Drive was a poltergeist and not a profit-turning, ever-present demonic being. After all, the happening similarities to other poltergeist cases are incredible, even down to minute details like eggs being consistently destroyed. Given that the phenomena, from what we are led to believe via Wilson and other credible researchers, took the family by surprise, suddenly imposing itself on their otherwise regular family life, it can be argued that they would not have had prior knowledge of similar incidents in other cases. most especially not in obscure, far-flung cases like the Poona poltergeist, in which egg destruction was reported as having been extremely common. In this way, it can be said that there is much potential in exploring the role played by children, particularly those entering or in the throes of adolescence in poltergeist cases. Might it even be the case that, far from being caused by an external, otherworldly entity, such peculiar happenings are somehow self-manifested, a physical materialization of thoughts and feelings, similar to the concept presented by Carl Jung when he spoke of catalytic exteriorization phenomenon? A young adult like Diane Pritchard, for example, may have felt deeply uncomfortable with her mother wanting to redecorate her bedroom and thus move and meddle with all of her intimate personal possessions. Such an intense feeling, made all the more intense by teenage hormones, might have manifested the physical happenings ascribed to Mr. Nobody. That there is little historical evidence to support the existence of a child predating 16th century monk in Pontefract gives more succor to this theory. And such a notion, which is by no means unheard of in parapsychological circles, need not threaten the paranormal dogma and protectionism which sadly have crept into so many cases and researchers in recent years. Rather than directly dispute the paranormal potentiality of the world, proving such to be true would affirm it, give fresh vigor to it, show that the world in which we live is as magical and mysterious as many of us believe it to be. One does not need to distort facts or piggyback someone else's experiences, manipulating them for your own aims, or worse, even inadvertently generating some manner of thought form or physically aggressive Black Monk tulpa in order to do so. Sometimes things just are what they are, and we should let them be as such, so that we can observe, study, and evolve from them. Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you might like to subscribe for more of the paranormal, or equally, if you haven't done so already, watch another of my videos. Until next time,